Our next speaker is Max Moore. Max Moore is CEO of Alcor Life Extension Foundation, which is the world's leading cryonics facility. Max Moore is also the author of Modern Transhumanism, which he wrote the philosophy in the 1990s, derived from ideas from the 1980s in his writings, and his paper was called Transhumanism. I'd like to introduce him as not only a leading transhumanist thinker and a philosopher, but also a board member of Humanity Plus. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. I realize that this audience is a little bit different from many audiences at Humanity Plus conferences, and I'm not sure exactly how familiar many of you are with transhumanism. So I'm going to say a little bit about that to set the context. I know often we have many of our members here, but I think we have many people who are not members and may not be that familiar with us. And also to explain what the heck does design have to do with transhumanism? And the answer is a lot. So transhumanism, okay, in very brief terms, one way I like to put it, to explain it very simply, to get an idea, transhumanism has, in a sense, two major elements, or two perspectives, if you like. Someone mentioned earlier in a question that there should be more social sciences. Well, I think some aspects of transhumanism are very technically oriented, and others are very philosophical and related to the humanities. And that relates to this two-part distinction I want to make, or two perspectives. On the one hand, you can think of transhumanism as transhuman-ism. In other words, emphasizing the idea, the technologies of becoming transhuman, which basically means moving from a purely human biological condition as defined by our genes, our genetic heritage, the limits of our brains, our neurological limitations, moving beyond that using technology, integrating technology, whether it's biological technologies or mechanical technologies, to overcome human limits. And that can have a lot of different effects. It can mean extending our lifespan beyond the current maximum human limit, which seems to be around 122. There are no verified cases of people living longer than that. It can mean morphological freedom, a term that I coined and which Anders Sandberg, who will be speaking later, has written extensively about. That's essentially the idea that we can choose how to redesign our bodies and our brains. We can reshape ourselves. And that's just barely starting to happen, as we know, just in the very early stages. It doesn't just mean physical stuff, though. It also means the emotions. Again, our emotions have largely been the product of our evolutionary heritage. We have certain kinds of motivations. We get angry and afraid and anxious and depressed for various evolutionary reasons, and we've modified that to some degree by culture. But the hard truth is that our brains impose certain limits on how we feel, how we can modify our feeling. There are very few connections, well, there are many connections going from the emotional centers of the brain to the cognitive centers, because there were good reasons for that. Back in the past, if you saw a lion charging at you, you wanted that to stimulate certain thoughts such as, get the hell out of here. But we don't have many pathways going back in the other direction, from the cognitive centers to the emotional centers. So if you're feeling depressed, you can't just say, don't worry, be happy, and then suddenly feel happy. It doesn't work that way. You can't just turn off anxiety. You can't just turn off anger. But maybe one day we can use, whether it's some kind of a nerve growth factor or nanorobots or some other device, to rewire the brain. Obviously, you don't do that very casually, not without a lot of modeling and experimentation, but maybe we could actually achieve deeper emotions, deeper understanding of our feelings and the roots of our feelings, and re-engineer those things. So that's all part of the transhumanist project. And of course, post-human cognition, in other words, expanding our intellectual cognitive capabilities beyond the human norm. So, when we talked about artificial general intelligence, in many ways these machines look set to overtake us in terms of cognitive ability, but maybe we can integrate ourselves with them. Maybe there are other ways of upgrading our ability. I sympathize with Howard this morning, who had a hard time remembering certain things and lost his train of thought. That happens to me all the time. I'd love to expand my working memory and make it more reliable. And all of these kind of goals are encapsulated in the metaphor of extropy, a term we use for Extropy Institute, which is in a sense the precursor of Humanity Plus. And that basically means rebelling against the lack of design in the universe. It's not supposed to be a technical opposite of entropy, but entropy essentially everything falls apart. In any kind of closed system, over time, the laws of thermodynamics have their way, and order falls apart. So extropy is all about bringing order back, useful, healthy order, not just unnecessary, pointless order. Not talking about bureaucratic order, but healthy order, the kind of order which keeps our bodies in shape, the kind of order that's involved in learning and in progress. So that's all about design. It's about redesigning the human being and our environment and designing our future. So, as I said, there are two perspectives on transhumanism. Transhumanism emphasizes the kind of more technologically drawn aspects of overcoming human limits at the neurological, genetic, and other levels. You can also think of it as transhumanism, and that's really the humanistic element. The social sciences element comes in here. I'm actually a philosopher by training, that's my background, economist and then philosopher, so I'm not a technologist. And that certainly informed my thinking about transhumanism and kind of defining how that works. It's not an entirely new philosophy, it's kind of a derivation or an evolution from 18th century Enlightenment humanism, sharing the same essential ideas that we believe in progress, not in just looking at the world and saying, oh, there's nothing we can do, let's just live things the way they are. Instead, it's challenging the way things are, constantly looking for ways to improve it. It emphasizes the idea of using our rational capabilities rather than using faith or revelation, and has some kind of sense of optimism. I use the term dynamic or practical optimism to distinguish it from the kind of optimism that says, we don't need to do anything, things will get better regardless. That's not the kind of optimism that's in transhumanism. It's an active form of optimism. So transhumanism, actually these ideas are all about design, about redesigning ourselves and redesigning the universe. But it's often seen that there is one thing that has resisted design, and that is death. Death seems like a very final thing, it's just there. All our metaphors for death, pretty discouraging. Death is a stop sign. Death is a black hole that sucks you down, never to be seen again. You disappear from the event horizon of life. Death is a cliff where you just fall off. Walk to the edge, that's it. It's the end of the road. So death would seem to be one thing that really can't be designed. Well, death isn't really what it used to be. Death is getting a bit old and worn and losing its vigor. And I think we can start to push back. Death doesn't really have a side that's going to chop our heads off. It's actually just a process of decay, degeneration, and it isn't even a single thing, as we'll talk a little bit more about. So maybe we can actually start to design death or design ways around death. Maybe death isn't actually a single event. Maybe it's not something that happens all at once. Maybe there are degrees of survival. When in a very trivial sense you can survive in a very minor way, not a way I find particularly satisfying, through your work. You can produce works that survive after your death, and in some sense those are traces of you. In my view, that's not sufficient, nor is having children sufficient. There's maybe a little bit of a comfort. But you can survive to varying degrees, as I'm going to argue. One important thing to recognize is that the terms death and dead are kind of curious. Death does have this very finalistic feeling to it, whereas the word dead, even though it's obviously totally closely derived from it, has a little bit of a different sense. Dead, we now start to think of people coming back from the dead. Now that may not really strictly speaking be accurate, but in common usage people talk about my car died, my battery died out. That doesn't mean you throw them away necessarily. You get them fixed. You find what caused the car to die, which really just means it stopped functioning. It doesn't mean it's gone. It doesn't mean all its information has turned to disorder. It doesn't mean it cannot be retrieved. It doesn't mean it's irreversible. You take it to the mechanic and you fix it, or you recharge the battery. So again, death isn't necessarily something that happens all at once or that is completely irreversible. Now, strictly speaking, maybe we should reserve the term dead and death for things you can never come back from. And that's fine. But in common usage, I think increasingly we're talking about people coming back from the dead, whether it's in emergency rooms, whether it's through cryopreservation or other methods, or in science fiction, various ways we can all discuss of partial survival, perhaps. So death may be losing a little bit of its grip. At least we can see ways that we might start to work around it, redesign it, and make it an object of design. And I think to do this, it's important to recognize that, again, life and death are not the only categories. If you really want to talk about a final state of death, let's define death so it really is something you can't come back from, it's irreversible. Well, to get to that, you have to go well beyond our current definitions. You can't talk about someone really being truly dead just because they stopped breathing, just because their heart stopped beating. As Stephen showed a very nice slide, which I wish I'd had actually, but then he would have shown it first anyway. There's that Victorian device of people who were buried and then they could pull a bell or a flag to say, hey, not dead yet. And indeed, they may have appeared dead, they may not have had a detectable heartbeat, they may have stopped breathing for some period of time. So what that shows us is that the criteria of death, if we mean true death, is a little bit more complex than we think. And even today, we've changed those criteria. If somebody apparently dies, clinically dies, we distinguish between clinical death and even legal death and true death. Now what we do is we don't just stand there like McCoy did on Star Trek and say, "He's dead, Jim." Instead, what we do is we pounce on them, we start injecting them with calcium channel blocker drugs and various other drugs, we do CPR, and quite often we bring them back. So it's a fuzzy border, it's not a clear line. Now, we don't know what it's like to be alive, but it means you're functioning and moving around. So maybe there's a third state in between being alive and being dead. And that's what I would argue, that already we have this kind of condition. In fact, I guess you could say in some sense, people in deep comas are kind of in this third state. They're kind of straddling the boundary between being alive and being in a third state, because some of their physiological functions are working. They may actually have to be supported in their breathing, but their conscious mind is not working, so that's kind of in stasis. But in the case of cryopreservation, or biostasis, kind of a more generic term, you are stopping all physical processes. You're stopping the decay process. So that person is really, they're not alive in any reasonable sense, because they're not walking around, they're not responsive, they're not thinking, they're not planning, they don't have those qualities of being alive, but they're not dead, not in any kind of final sense, because all the information that tells you what kind of person they are, their personality, their physical structure, could be very intact. That's going to depend on the particular case. It's a matter of degree. Again, it's a matter of degree, not an absolute. So I think it's useful to talk about a third state of biostasis, or even more generally, sometimes use the term inactivate to imply you've been deactivated and you're in a holding pattern. For instance, one possibility would be, many of you will be familiar with the idea of uploading, very popular in science fiction right now and often discussed among transhumanists. If you had your brain completely scanned at sufficient level, and then your body was destroyed, but that mind file could be re-embodied at some time in the future, many of us think, well, that's going to be you. You've come back. So where were you in the meantime? Well, you were kind of gone, but not exactly. You were inactivate. You were deactivated, waiting to come back. Now, currently, well, there are several methods, as I mentioned, of going through the third state in the hopes that you can redesign around absolute death. But and some people have thought about this before. You know, the mummies had their method. Unfortunately, the mummification method wasn't really very practical from our current understanding of science, because what they did in the mummification process, they sucked your brains out through your nostrils, which is really not the best way to go about preserving personality. But I guess they didn't think that your personality was in the brain at the time. Even Aristotle, who I have huge respect for, seemed to think that your consciousness was down maybe in the heart region or something. Benjamin Franklin is an interesting guy. He had a bit of thought about this. He was an amazing thinker in many areas, and he thought, well, I'd really like to see the future. You know, science and technology are progressing. Everything's getting better in many ways, and because he knew a huge amount about all the areas of progress, and he wanted to see that future. So he kind of mused, well, perhaps when I die, instead of burying me or burning me, you could put me in a nice vat of Madeira, and I can just kind of marinate there and come out sometime in the future to see what's become of my country. Good idea. The Madeira part seems like a pretty good idea. There's a vat, but not quite the right technology. So I'll skip to this one. So a more practical technology is to be placed in a dewar. Now, I'm not talking about the bottle of scotch, although we have to thank Mr. Dewar, the Scottish fellow who kind of designed these vacuum flasks. So Ben Franklin might prefer to be stored in the one on the left, but unfortunately it's more likely to be the one on the right. Now, the method of cryopreservation, this is something I first heard about actually when I was really quite young in an old British TV series for children, which none of you will have heard of, I'm sure, called Time Slip. I think I was about 10 when I watched this. And in the very first story, which you can actually now get thanks to the BBC, these are on DVD, and I have to recommend watching that. The first story, not really the rest of them so much, but the first story has cryopreservation, it has uploading, it has cognitive augmentation, all kinds of amazing ideas for that time, in a children's TV show. And then they actually had cryopreservation, and I thought, well, that's kind of a cool idea. It's too bad it's not real. And then I think around 1981, maybe 1982, I read a book by Robert Anton Wilson. You might be familiar with his Illuminatus books. And in his book, non-fiction book, well, kind of non-fiction book, Cosmic Trigger, he talked about his daughter who was murdered and had her brain cryopreserved. And that's the first time I heard about it done for real. And a few years later, in 1986, I came over to America for the first time and spent about 6 weeks here at the Alcohol Life Extension Foundation and learned how to do the whole process. I went back to England and started the first European cryonics organization. So kind of a long history with that, and it's changed over the years, but essentially the process, Stephen Valentine gave you a bit of an idea of this. The basic idea is ideally, we don't always have ideal conditions, but ideally if you know that you're going to die, in quotes, going to become clinically dead or legally dead in the near future, then ideally Alcor will send out a standby team, as we call it, and as soon as legal death has been declared, because currently it's illegal to do it before legal death, that might change sometime in the future if Vermont leads the way, but basically within 30 seconds of legal death being declared, the Alcor team will start cooling you externally, start accessing your circulatory system and washing out the blood, cooling you down, and to cut a long story short, you'll be transferred back to the Alcor Foundation, and through various different stages, you'll gradually be reduced to minus 196 degrees C, minus 320 Fahrenheit. And at that temperature, nothing really is changing. Okay, maybe there's a few little changes from quantum rays knocking the occasional atom out of place, little teeny bits of quantum tunneling, but basically, you're not changing. You could stay there for 1,000 years, and you'd be pretty much in the same shape as when you started, which is just slightly dead. Not really dead at all. If you define death as irreversible, that you can't come back from, you're not dead at all. But in common parlance, you're just a little bit dead. Because actually, if you look at some of those people who've been declared legally dead, they could be revived. That's why in hospitals you have things called no code, which basically tells doctors, if this person's heartbeat stops or breathing stops, don't try and resuscitate them, because you can do it, but they're only going to come back for half an hour or a few minutes, and they're going to be miserable. There's no point. So they're not even really irreversibly clinically dead. They could have been brought back. So ideally, we start very early on in that process and stop the decay process very, very quickly. Now, cryopreservation is not the only method of doing it. There are various other methods. It could be chemical preservation. There are various attempts right now to do brain plastination. DNA preservation is a very low fidelity way. You'll be more dead than you would be with cryopreservation, because your DNA only describes how to grow a clone of you, basically the genetic structure. You're going to lose everything that you've learned over a lifetime. But maybe if you combine DNA preservation with personality capture, let's see, yeah, basically DNA plus a mind file, and the kind of thing Howard was talking about, maybe if you have a device that's that smart, it can also record everything you do. It can learn who you are, it can learn all your words and mannerisms and everything. And if you had enough of that kind of information, combine it with your genetic profile, again, you might be only partly dead if you didn't bother to get cryopreserved or enjoy the life extension revolution. And there are various options here, again, ways of designing death or designing a way around death. You can choose the whole body option, or you can just preserve the brain. The point of that being that any kind of technology that can reverse whatever killed you in the first place, that can fix the aging problem and repair any damage done by the vitrification or freezing process, is probably going to generate a new body fairly easily. I'd say trivially, but it really isn't a trivial problem. So, really what I'm saying is that death, or what we've traditionally thought of as death, is something we can work around, we can design around it, we can choose how we go, or partly go, or not go at all. And we can make plans, apart from choosing to make arrangements for cryopreservation, or having a mind file, your DNA preserved. You can also make certain choices. You can choose whole body or neuro. You can also plan for the future. We can't guarantee that these wishes will be followed, but you can put in your contract with the cryonics organization that you only want to come back under certain circumstances. Do you want to just come back in a body that's been repaired but is otherwise identical? Do you want to wait for a body where aging has been conquered? Do you want to come back in a synthetic body? Are you happy with that? Do you want to have an enhanced body? Do you want to skip all that and have the frozen brain scanned and just be uploaded into cyberspace or into a synthetic body or series of bodies? Or do you want to wait to come back with family and friends? Those are all choices that you can make and give you options for designing death, or strictly speaking, designing your way around death. And if anybody has any further questions, I'll be here for the rest of the weekend. Since the beginning of this year, I've become the president of the Alcohol Life Extension Foundation, so I can answer pretty much any of your questions about the cryopreservation process and how you do that. But that's my message. If you think of yourself as design thinkers, then don't draw a line at designing your life and your work. Think about designing your way around death. Don't accept it. Thank you.